It began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a single page slipping from the closed chambers of Brussels carried the weight of an empire's fear. Behind the polished glass of NATO halls, Donald Trump had issued a demand that cut through the pretense of diplomacy: raise tariffs on Africa's lifeblood, oil and gold, or watch them starve. It was not partnership. It was not policy. It was economic war, dressed in the robes of civility. In Ouagadougou, the answer was not silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré heard the words for what they were: a declaration against dignity, and he chose defiance. At dawn, he gathered his advisors, his voice rising above the tension. If Africa bowed today, tomorrow it would be chained forever. What followed was no ordinary decision, but a moment that could redraw the map of power itself. Do not look away. What comes next may shift the course of history. Subscribe and stay with us. This story is not just about tariffs. It is about freedom. And so the question emerges: when the West tried to tighten its grip, did it awaken a revolution that cannot be contained? The whisper from Brussels was more than gossip. It was a crack in the armor of Western diplomacy, revealing the raw calculus behind polished speeches. Donald Trump's demand was stark: impose tariffs on Africa's oil and gold until the continent submitted. The words were not crafted for the public, but when they slipped into the open, they carried the scent of coercion. Oil and gold, not mere commodities, but oxygen for Europe's industries, arteries for America's markets. To strangle them was to place a hand on Africa's throat. For decades, the continent had endured such hands. Contracts written in distant capitals had drained wells and emptied mines, leaving villages with promises but no prosperity. Loans dressed as aid had returned as chains of dependency. To most observers, this was the natural order, but not to Ibrahim Traoré. In Ouagadougou, the leaked memo landed like dry season thunder. Traoré stood before his circle of advisors in the half-light of morning. His words cut through the stillness. This is not about tariffs. This is about control. If we surrender today, we surrender forever. In that moment, silence gave way to resolve. By mid-morning, calls traveled across the Sahel. Mali, Guinea, Niger, nations long bound by colonial borders, were summoned not for charity, but for solidarity. Days later, in a heavily guarded hall in West Africa, leaders gathered away from the marble of Geneva and the chandeliers of Paris. Here, the air was heavy, not with formality, but with defiance. One after another, voices rose with the same refrain: gold siphoned through shadow contracts, oil fields fenced off by foreign firms, revenues that bled away while their people endured poverty. For the first time in decades, the conversation shifted. No more appeals for aid. No more patience for empty promises. Traoré set the tone. If they dare impose tariffs, then we will dare something greater. We will close the valves of oil and gold. We will find partners who respect us. The words lingered in the room like fire. Risky, dangerous. Yet each leader, after a pause, nodded. In that convergence lay a turning point. Fractured voices aligning into one unyielding answer. News of the decision traveled not through official communiques, but through the mouths of ordinary people. Radios carried fragments of speeches. Market stalls buzzed with speculation. And in the squares of Ouagadougou and Bamako, chants rose into the night. If they want our oil and gold, they will have to take our dignity too. Across Africa, the leak became a mirror. Farmers wondered whether their harvests would still reach markets. Mothers worried over medicine and school fees. Merchants counted their coins with unease. But alongside the fear burned pride. a flame long suppressed, now fanned by the courage of leaders daring to say no. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, a young student held a sign scrawled in bold, "Better hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The crowd roared. For once, their voices were not echoes of desperation, but affirmations of choice. Traore knew the cost. Freezing exports would squeeze his own people before it shook foreign capitals. Yet he also knew that suffering without dignity was worse than hardship with freedom. And so, in the heart of Africa, a decision was made that would ripple far beyond its borders. This was no longer the story of a leaked memo. It was the first note in a storm that would test not just economies, but the very balance of power. The world had heard Africa's defiance, but how would Europe and America respond when the valves of oil and gold were no longer theirs to command? The decision taken in the hidden hall of West Africa did not stay hidden for long. It spilled into the streets, into the voices of the young, into the markets where merchants whispered of shortages to come. But more powerful than fear was the sense that something extraordinary had begun. For decades, Africa had been spoken for. Now it was speaking back. In Ouagadougou, the morning after the summit, crowds surged into Independence Square. Banners waved in the dry wind. A student stood tall on a crate, holding a sign that read, "Better hunger for a year than slavery for a century." The words cut through the air like a blade, echoing in chants that rolled across the square and beyond. What was once private resistance had become public defiance. Traoré appeared on national television. He was not flanked by generals in starched uniforms, but by miners with dust still on their overalls and farmers whose calloused hands told their own history. His voice was steady, almost unpolished, yet it carried the weight of truth. "We may suffer in the short term," he declared, "but suffering with dignity is better than living forever on our knees." The reaction was electric. Radios replayed his words in dusty villages. Social media lit up with messages from Kinshasa to Lagos. "If Traoré stands, we stand." For once, Africa was not a continent of silent endurance, but of collective will. In Europe, the effect was immediate. In Frankfurt, traders watched gold prices surge skyward, their screens flashing red with every uptick. In Paris, energy planners whispered that more than half of France's nuclear power relied on uranium from Niger, a lifeline suddenly uncertain. In Milan, electric car executives convened emergency meetings, aware that without cobalt and lithium from Congo, their green revolution could collapse before it took root. It was not just resources, it was oxygen. Traoré's hand had turned the valve, and Europe was gasping. In Brussels, ministers sat through sleepless nights. For years, they had preached partnership, aid, mutual growth. But the memos on their desks told a harsher truth. Europe needed Africa far more than Africa needed Europe. Washington's voice thundered through the conference calls. "Stand united behind tariffs," Trump demanded. "Africa will crawl back once their treasuries run dry." Yet the silence in the room spoke volumes. A German minister broke it with words that carried both warning and despair. "Sanction them, and we sanction ourselves. Our auto industry cannot survive without Congolese cobalt. Our grids cannot run without Niger's uranium." No one dared echo him publicly. To defy Washington outright was political suicide. Still, doubt seeped through the cracks. Opposition parties across Europe seized the moment. In Berlin, lawmakers asked why European workers should pay the price of a tariff war. In Paris, unions warned of mass layoffs if gold markets collapsed. In London, commentators posed the unthinkable question on late-night television. Have we underestimated Africa's power? Trump's rallies told a different story. Before roaring crowds, he vowed to teach Africa its place, framing the crisis as proof of Western supremacy. But beyond the applause, diplomats heard another sound, the creak of a global order under strain, a system cracking beneath the arrogance that had sustained it. And while Europe wrestled with division, BRICS nations moved swiftly. In Beijing, trade officials announced emergency credit lines for African exporters, bypassing Western banks entirely. In Moscow, delegations offered joint ventures in refining and drilling, promising that no tariff could touch resources rebranded under Eurasian contracts. In New Delhi, the boldest move came, a pledge to purchase Sahelian crude through long-term agreements, guaranteeing a market even if Europe shut its doors. For Africa, these offers were lifelines. Yet Traore and his allies did not rush. They had learned from history that one dependency could too easily replace another. Instead, they moved cautiously. Economists were dispatched to secure reserves. Engineers deployed to safeguard pipelines and mines. Soldiers stationed to guard against sabotage. This was not survival. This was sovereignty in motion. And then, on a warm evening, as families gathered around radios and screens, Traore delivered the words that crystallized the moment. They say we are reckless. I say we are free. Oil and gold do not belong to Europe. They belong to Africa. From this day forward, they will flow only with dignity. The words were fire. In Lagos, murals appeared overnight. Barrels of oil draped in African flags. In Kinshasa, marketplaces erupted in cheers. Across the diaspora in Paris and New York, Africans posted one phrase: "If Traore stands, we stand." The world had been given its answer. Africa was no longer pleading. It was proclaiming. Yet, as the chants grew louder and the markets trembled, the West prepared to strike back with weapons not of steel, but of finance and technology. The storm did not take long to arrive. Europe and America, unable to ignore Africa's defiance, reached for weapons honed not on battlefields, but in boardrooms. Within days, Western banks froze accounts tied to state-owned companies in Burkina Faso and Mali. Cargo ships laden with crude and bullion found themselves stranded in Mediterranean ports, their paperwork suddenly under review. Insurance firms, all based in Western capitals, refused to cover African shipments. Oil and gold could not move without their approval. And now that approval was withheld, the assault deepened in the digital realm. Anonymous cyber units probed government servers in Ouagadougou and Bamako. Websites crashed. Financial transfers were delayed. Electricity grids flickered under relentless intrusion. A campaign of coordinated media followed, painting Ibrahim Traoré as reckless, a strong man dragging his people into ruin. Editorials in Paris and London warned that Africa's gamble would collapse into hunger and chaos. And on the ground, the hardship was real. Prices climbed. Medicines grew scarce. Families lined up longer at markets, their coins buying less each week. Parents wondered how long schools could stay open. Farmers asked whether their harvests would rot without buyers abroad. For many, survival became a daily calculation, measured in teaspoons of grain and drops of fuel. But instead of fracturing communities, the pressure welded them tighter. In dusty villages, volunteers pooled food for neighbors. Students created networks to keep classrooms alive. Farmers shared transport to ensure crops reached local markets without relying on foreign intermediaries. In the very places where the West expected cracks to appear, resilience took root. At an emergency summit of the Alliance of Sahel States, Traoré gave words to what his people already understood. They are trying to turn our people against us. They believe hardship will break us, but hardship is not new to Africa. What is new is our refusal to kneel. His declaration was met with applause, not of ceremony, but of conviction. The alliance responded with measures that startled foreign observers. Resource convoys were placed under joint military escort to prevent sabotage. Local banks launched gold-backed payment systems designed to bypass Western transfers. Engineers worked overnight to stabilize fragile power grids. Burkina Faso announced the creation of a sovereign reserve fund, fueled by revenues from oil and gold withheld from export. These were not acts of desperation, but of determination. In markets across West Africa, people began to speak differently. They no longer described themselves as victims of sanctions, but as participants in a struggle for dignity. A woman in Bamako told a journalist, "If we endure this, my children will remember not the hunger, but the freedom." In Niamey, a farmer said, "We have lost more to silence than we ever will to sacrifice." For decades, Africa's resource story had been one of extraction, raw wealth flowing outward while dependency flowed inward. Now, the script was being rewritten. Each failed attempt to fracture the continent only seemed to reinforce its cohesion. And though the suffering was undeniable, so too was the pride. Western capitals, however, were not prepared to relent. From Washington came louder threats. From Brussels, tighter restrictions. The message was simple: yield or perish. But on African soil, the response was equally clear: resist or lose dignity forever. This was the essence of the struggle, not just trade wars or tariff disputes, but a contest over who would write Africa's future. And at the center of it all stood Ibrahim Traoré, a leader cast by Western headlines as reckless, yet embraced by his people as a symbol of courage. In international commentary, whispers began to form a new phrase, Ibrahim Traoré coup, not just as a reference to political change in Burkina Faso, but as shorthand for a continental uprising against dependency itself. Yet while Africa braced against sanctions and scarcity, a darker revelation was waiting to surface, one that would expose not just tactics of pressure, but the very plans of theft hidden beneath them. The next tremor did not come from sanctions or cyber strikes. It came from another leak. The same anonymous European journalist who had first exposed the tariff plan surfaced once more, this time with documents more damning than before. Draft contracts and email chains revealed that Western conglomerates had already negotiated secret deals to privatize Africa's oil fields and gold mines under the guise of stabilization programs. The language was blunt: Niger's oil reserves to be leased for 50 years at cut-rate prices. Gold from Burkina Faso funneled directly into offshore accounts beyond African treasuries. What had been framed as tariffs was in truth a strategy for permanent control. When the story broke, outrage swept the continent. Protests erupted in Bamako and Ouagadougou, crowds storming offices of foreign firms. Placards read, "No more hidden chains." Diaspora communities in Paris and New York joined demonstrations, demanding transparency from Western corporations. What had begun as an economic standoff had now transformed into a referendum on sovereignty. Across Africa, the anger carried an undertone of vindication. For years, suspicion had lingered that aid and loans masked exploitation. Now the evidence was undeniable. Analysts confirmed that the contracts mirrored patterns used during colonial times. A bitter truth had been laid bare. The chains had never been broken, only reshaped. Internationally, the reaction was seismic. European leaders scrambled to deny the documents, calling them fabrications. Yet the signatures were too familiar, the figures too precise. Opposition parties across Europe seized the moment, accusing their governments of hypocrisy. Commentators in South America drew parallels with their own history of resource plunder. In Asia, newspapers declared the rise of a new axis of dignity. For Africa, the revelation turned sacrifice into proof. The shortages, the higher prices, the long queues. These were not signs of reckless leadership, but of resistance against a theft centuries in the making. What had begun as a tariff dispute was now the Burkina Faso Revolution, a struggle no longer about economics alone, but about reclaiming the right to decide. Yet as Africa stood taller, the question lingered. Could this fragile unity withstand the relentless pressure still gathering from the West? The summit halls of the Sahel no longer echoed with desperation, but with determination. From the hardship of sanctions and the revelation of hidden contracts emerged a bold idea, an African resource charter. It would no longer treat oil, gold, uranium, or cobalt as commodities to be traded at the whim of foreign markets, but as instruments of sovereignty, drafted by economists, debated by engineers, and guarded by soldiers. The charter sought to turn resource wealth into leverage rather than liability. No longer would contracts be signed in secret corridors of foreign capitals. Instead, they would be guided by transparency and mutual respect. The message was unmistakable. Africa would choose its partners, not its masters. The road ahead, however, was steep. Two futures stood before the continent. In one, Western pressure tightened further. Sanctions deepened, propaganda sharpened, and attempts at destabilization multiplied. In the other, Africa's unity held, forging alliances beyond its old dependencies and building an economy where resources no longer left as raw materials, but as value-added exports controlled at home. Traore spoke of this choice in simple but potent words. We are not merely resisting, we are rebuilding. Each barrel of oil, each ounce of gold, is not just wealth. It is a seed for the harvest of freedom. His metaphor resonated because it framed the struggle, not as a siege, but as a season, harsh, testing, but leading towards renewal. Across Africa, people embraced the uncertainty with an unexpected pride. Markets buzzed not only with worry, but with a new vocabulary: resilience, dignity, sovereignty. Youth movements organized teach-ins about resource justice. Farmers spoke of storing harvests for lean months ahead. Even diaspora communities began to invest in local cooperatives, determined to contribute to the continent's self-reliance. International observers saw both peril and promise. Some predicted chaos, warning that Africa's stand would collapse under economic strain. Others sensed that history's pendulum was shifting, that a new chapter was being written where the old hierarchies would no longer hold. The path forward was not a promise of ease, but of meaning. Hardship would bite, but it would bite with purpose. And that, perhaps, was the most revolutionary change of all. As Africa drafted its own future, the world faced a choice: meet the continent as equals, or risk a confrontation with a generation no longer willing to kneel. From a whisper in Brussels to chants in Ouagadougou, the journey of this story has revealed more than a clash of tariffs. It has exposed the heart of a struggle over sovereignty. What began as a secret memo urging higher duties on Africa's oil and gold unfolded into a confrontation that laid bare the hypocrisy of partnership long proclaimed by the West. Africa did not respond with silence. It answered with unity. Families tightened their belts. Students organized. Farmers shared their harvests. Leaders who once stood apart now stood together. And at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré emerged not as a reckless populist, but as a symbol of resilience, a man who dared to call economic warfare by its name and to defy it with dignity. The revelations that followed, contracts designed to seize oil and gold for half a century, confirmed what many had always feared. Yet they also transformed hardship into proof, sacrifice into purpose. For the first time in living memory, Africa was no longer only on the defensive. It was asserting its right to shape its own destiny. Internationally, the phrase Ibrahim Traoré coup spread, not only marking a moment in Burkina Faso's history, but becoming shorthand for defiance across a continent. The Burkina Faso Revolution was no longer about one nation, but about the principle that sovereignty is not negotiable, that dignity is not for sale. The future remains uncertain. Sanctions may tighten, markets may convulse, propaganda may intensify, but something irreversible has already begun. Oil and gold are no longer seen as chains, but as keys to unlock a different future, one where Africa is not a marketplace for exploitation, but a partner at the table of equals. And so, the question passes to us, the viewers, the listeners, the witnesses of this unfolding history. If one small, landlocked nation can defy an empire's demands, what stops the rest of the world from rewriting its own story? If this struggle for dignity resonates with you, do not let the story end here. Share it, comment on it, subscribe, and walk with us into the chapters yet unwritten.